As we continue our series on psychedelic mushrooms, we have to take some time to understand the nature and importance of subjective experience. Everyone's experience is very different when they consume these compounds. Because of this, I thought it was important to take some time to learn a little bit about what people experience and what those experiences mean to them. And that's the topic of today's discussion. So let's recap part one. I know it's been a while since I did part one. Things have been busy, but trying to get back on schedule. So what are these compounds? Well, it's a group. Maybe group's not the best word. It is a collection of species of psychedelic mushrooms. And these mushrooms have the compounds psilocybin and psilocin in different amounts, mostly psilocybin. We learned that as psilocybin passes through the body via this thing called the first pass that a lot of drugs go through, it becomes psilocin in a smaller amount. Now, this is the active ingredient. So we talked a little bit about that and some other things. Then we mentioned some of the stigma, where kind of some of this stigma originated in the 1960s. And this stigma still continues today, unfortunately. Then we talked about some really interesting research studies that showed some of the potentials therapeutically of these mushrooms. There was a study done on major depressive disorder. Only had about 24 people, and what it showed was a reduction in what's called the HAM-D score, an assessment used to measure depression severity. It was over a 12-point reduction, which is pretty significant. Then we talked about a study involving terminal cancer patients' depression and their anxiety. And that had about 51 people. They showed an 80% decrease in anxiety and depression in these patients, and an increase in hope and the acceptance of death, along with other things. These are two of the many research studies that have gone on regarding these compounds. Part 3 is going to be a bunch of different studies. We're going to kind of talk about some of those things. I think it's going to be really interesting. But let's continue. So what is a mushroom trip? Well, here's my little definition. I think it is a meaningful. Now, what do I mean by meaningful? I don't necessarily mean positive or negative. Whether you experience something in this experience or when it's over, there is some sort of meaning. I think there's some sort of value, whether good or bad, towards that experience. It could be only when you trip, or it could last past that trip. That's what I mean by meaningful. It is highly subjective. It all depends on the person. No experience is the same as another. But it also comes with these abnormal psychic and neurological effects. When I say psychic, I don't mean like Professor X. I mean affecting the psyche. A question I want you guys to ask yourselves, especially those of you who have little to no experience with compounds like this, or little to no knowledge, is what do I think a mushroom trip is? Now, why ask that question? Well, it seems like a lot of our ideas about substances like this, if we don't have direct experience, is rooted in media and movies. And oftentimes there's very much a sensationalist flavor on these experiences. You know, you'll see people I don't know, talking trees or unicorns or whatever. And the mushroom experience is simply not that. It can't be boiled down to a couple of different pieces. And I think a lot of people tend to think on the extreme. And hopefully this video, we're going to talk about the wide variety of things one can experience when taking mushrooms. Another important point is that these are not for everyone. It's very clear in general that some people have benefit or experience benefit and some do not. So it's really not for everyone, just like alcohol or caffeine or cannabis. It works for some, not for others. So now I want to talk about what a mushroom trip is and what it is not. And I'm only going to hit on a few things. So what is it? Well, it turns out that you can experience no hallucinations or heavy hallucinations. This varies depending on how much you consume. So what it's not constant hallucination. I make that point because, like I said before, media and movies or whatever might make us think that you're just seeing stuff all the time, and that's simply not true. These experiences can be very life-changing and meaningful in a positive way. They're not always life-changing and meaningful, though. Sometimes it seems like people talk about these substances like they always have a positive effect, but they really don't. What it is, though, is a wide variety of experience. And this depends on the person, the setting, and the mindset, along with other things. It's not always happy or positive. You're not always losing a grip on reality. Now, if you go on Reddit, I actually got a lot of information from Reddit, really helpful. You'll find people that have had very strong experiences that feel like they're losing a grip on reality. But that's usually someone who's taking a lot of mushrooms at one time. You do get a change in perspective. You can get a change in perspective. And this can be small to large. And what it is not, there's just all sorts of other generalizations that people can make. And sometimes people think it's one set experience, and it's really not. As I mentioned, these are just some things. I just wanted to kind of do a comparison and contrast to kind of set things up. So let's continue. So let's discuss some basics. This slide, along with others, I got information from the our psilocybin mushrooms subreddit, which is very, very helpful. If you want to go on there, you'll learn a lot about different people's experiences, and you'll see how different they are. But let's continue. The effect seems to be very species dependent, with psilocybe cubensis being, I believe, the most common. I think this is in North America. It really depends on where you are in the world, but there are more common species than others. Biology plays a huge role. As far as biological differences, everyone is different, which will produce a different experience. And as I mentioned before, subjectivity is of the utmost importance. And another thing I wanted to mention is that audio and visual phenomena vary. And visual phenomena can be called things like closed eye visuals and open eye visuals. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So let's talk about dosing really quickly. I got this little chart from a very well-liked post on our psilocybin mushrooms. It seems like there's different charts. I'm going to go with this one. If you don't like it, it is what it is. This Redditor categorized it from very light to what's called heroic. Very light, 0.5 to 1 gram. Light, 1 to 1.5. Mild, 1.5 to 2. Common, 2 to 3. Strong, 3 to 4. Very strong, 4 to 5. Heroic, 5 or more. Heroic being exactly what the word says. It's a very, very strong dose. It takes a brave soul because a lot happens. And as we'll discuss, every experience depends on how much you take, along with all sorts of other things. So let's talk about prep work. Now, what do I mean? I mean something called set and setting. If you're familiar with these types of substances, or at least know a little bit about it, these two words will make a lot of sense. But let's talk about what they mean. What is set? Well, here we're talking about mindset. How do you feel? Are you calm? Are you anxious? Are you sad? What's going through your mind? the emotions you have are very, very important when considering a mushroom trip. You've got to figure out what's going on the inside, because these will affect the journey that you go on. And then setting. Well, what is setting? Well, exactly what it is. Where are you going to be? Are you going to have someone with you? Some people call it a trip sitter. Are you going to be alone? With friends? Are you going to be outside? Inside? In the daytime? At night? All of these factors need to be considered when you're about to have a mushroom trip. And as you can see, something that's important is planning your day. These things last for hours depending on how much you consume, but you should plan the day. From what I saw, people plan the day because you want to make sure things are set out for the best experience. So let's talk about some positives. Visuals can be a positive. There's enhanced euphoria, relaxation, happiness, or otherwise intense emotion, empathy. There can be times of heavy reflection. Now, I do want to mention reflection and visuals could also be negative depending on what's going on. These experiences can be very life-changing. People can, depending on how much they consume, feel this oneness with everything, with the animals, with the trees, with their friends. It's a very interesting, consistent feeling that people have, although it might represent itself in different ways. Let's talk about the negatives. I put these in quotations because it's all relative, it's all subjective. But I wanted to mention some of the ones I saw. I did say visuals. Some people see things they might consider positive. Some people they see things that might kind of scare them. Anxiety, depression, or feelings of sadness, maybe not depression. Paranoia, negative thoughts and feelings. Some people say they get caught in like a thought loop where negative feelings and thoughts keep rising to the surface. Some people don't like the physical sensations that they feel during these experiences. And then I saw some people talk about what's called the come up. That feeling from being your normal state of mind to rising into this trip. Some people can feel a little anxious. Also, a lot of people experience nausea because of the way the mushrooms interact with like your stomach and stuff like that. So let's continue. So before we talk a little bit more, I want to talk about something called microdosing. Now, what is microdosing? In my definition, it's the minimum effective dose. Now, this doesn't just apply to mushrooms. You're basically taking the smallest amount you can that gives you a certain effect. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like for mushrooms. So dosing. As I mentioned in my other videos, the amount of substances you take in like grams or milligrams, whatever, will affect the effect it has on the body. So from what I saw and read, the range that I've seen is 0.2 to 0.5 grams. Sometimes people do this thing where they take dried mushrooms and put them in a little capsule and they'll take that. And then there is something called a schedule. Some people might call it a protocol. This is the schedule that you'll have while you take this substance. And there's a reason why people have different schedules. So let's talk about one. So day one, you take your dose. Now, what happens on day one? So day one can be thought of as the most potent day. So what does this mean? Well, here, let's talk about what people say they experience when they microdose. Some people say that they have an elevated mood. Colors are a little brighter, not significant, but just a little bit. Heightened creativity. Feel a little bit more mellow, a little bit more calm. Their emotional awareness is increased. empathy, along with other things. So when people microdose, there is no hallucination, there's no really strong, profound experience. It seems like it's kind of just like a level up, a little bit higher creativity, a little bit higher emotion. And people will microdose mushrooms in a lot of different settings because you don't really need to do a heavy planning of your day. You can go about your day like you normally would. Now, how about day 2? Well, you can think of day 2 being a more residual day. You're not taking another dose. What it is the dose that was potent the day before is a little less potent, but still affecting you on day 2. And then we have day 3. This is your rest day or your break day. By this time, you should not really be feeling any of the effects of the microdose. And this schedule is done because of tolerance. If you're trying to get the most out of these compounds with this smaller dose for that creativity, enhanced mood, things like that, you don't want to build up a heavy tolerance. Because you're doing it at a minimum, you're separating the time between doses. So here it looks like you'll do twice a week. Now, why do people do this? Well, it turns out a lot of people find that it helps them with things like depression or low mood. It helps out with things like anxiety. It helps people kind of look outside of themselves to kind of see what's going on and to learn about themselves more. And some people want to change a perspective to help them look at life a little differently. What's interesting is that microdosing is not uncommon at all. People microdose things like MDMA, LSD, they microdose ketamine. From what I understand, it's big in the tech world because here we're talking about enhanced creativity, a little bit of a boost. So a lot of people will find it very helpful as they do their work. It allows them to kind of look at things differently. And overall, it seems like a lot of people have great experiences. And it seems like, from what people say, it's relatively safe and effective. Now, obviously, I think there are studies being done on microdosing mushrooms. A lot of them on mushrooms are being done with higher doses. But overall, it does seem like there's very little side effects because you're consuming such a small amount. And it's pretty effective for people who do take them. So this is why people will microdose these substances. So let's continue. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into subjective experience. I mentioned before that everyone has a different experience. There seem to be clear benefits in some ways, but not all the time. And I mentioned that they're really not for everyone. You can have what people call a good trip, or what people call a bad trip. Now, all of this is very relative. There are some people that have had what they call bad trips, but eventually ended up being very good for them. And then some people have bad trips and it's terrible. An interesting quote I saw in a book, and we're going to talk about a little story from this book, is this: you bring a different self to each journey. You can take mushrooms today and then take them 3 months from now. You're going to have 2 very different experiences. So I want to share a brief little story from this guy named Michael Pollan, who's a writer. I believe he teaches at Harvard, or at least I think he still does. And he wrote this book called How to Change Your Mind. And in this book, which is a very good book, if you want to get a really good book on someone's personal study and understanding of the different psychedelics that are out there, this is an amazing book. I think it's very well written, and it gives you a little bit of a history and his experience with certain psychedelics like DMT or mushrooms and things like that. So what I'm going to do here is share with you a story that he wrote about regarding his personal mushroom experience. So there's a couple things. He was with a trained guide who was a little bit new age in a way. and gave him about a 3-gram mushroom. She said a little prayer, and there's a bunch of other stuff that happened. He put on a blindfold. And so all of his experiences, most of them I'm going to share, are with what's called closed eye visuals. He saw some stuff when he opened his eyes, and I'll talk about that. But a lot of this that he saw was with the blindfold on. So music was playing, and he saw himself, or he saw this futuristic city. This city had these soft black structures coming out from the ground. And as the notes played, more structures sprung up from the ground. And he kind of felt like this was a little bit annoying. He felt like it was a little distracting, and it wasn't really what he was looking for. But then he had to use a bathroom, and this is where things get interesting. He opened the blindfolds, and colors were a lot brighter. And when he went to the bathroom, he said that when he peed into the toilet, it was like a waterfall of diamonds that kind of broke down into fractals of light. Very, very significant experience. And he highlighted the beauty of all these little things like the light and the colors, and it was very, very profound for him in those moments. After a little time, the guide gave him a little booster. She asked him if he wanted a little bit more, and he took an extra gram. Now here's where things get pretty interesting. So when he took that booster, some things changed. He felt like he kind of turned into these pieces of paper, but he was also observing those pieces of paper dissolving. So he talked about, he was like, I turned into these pieces of paper, but I was also observing that I turning into this paper. I know it's a little weird. He kind of felt like he was kind of dissolving. He felt like this might have been a smaller version of what people might call the dissolution of the ego. While this was a little startling to him, it didn't scare him. He was kind of very content with these things happening. And again, this is all closed eye visuals. And then at one point, he found himself, or he saw this desert, very dry desert landscape. In this desert, he saw skulls. And these were not just any ordinary skulls. They were the skulls of people who died that he knew. Now, this was profound to him because he was saying, okay, these are people who have died. But then he saw his wife or partner among the dead. And his wife was also close to, at least in this little experience, his aunt. They had a very unique connection because both had breast cancer. His aunt died, his wife, in his words, was spared. So he kind of got a little scared. He's like, why is my wife among the dead? She's not dead. So for him, this was kind of the bad trip part of this experience. And he felt like he had to cope and understand and come to grips with death, with the fact that his loved ones will die and he can't really do anything about it. Then she changed the music. He kind of got a little annoyed and changed to some classical cello music. Now, what's interesting here is that he felt like as the music was playing, he found himself in the walls of the cello itself. He found that these cello walls, the interior of this instrument, was the perfect room to write in. And he is a writer. So this was very, very interesting to him. And then as time went on, and throughout this experience, he kind of felt the strings and felt the music, and he felt like he was blending in with this whole sensory experience. And then he felt like he became the instrument itself. Now, I know this might sound really weird, but for him, this was all a very synergistic, peaceful, and profound experience that he was having. And this made a pretty big impact on him as he reflected on what he went through. One important thing I wanted to mention is that, briefly after this experience, he felt like he took a lot from it, but after some time, it felt like almost he hadn't had that experience. Like it didn't have this long-lasting impact, but he noted how important it was for him to go through this. This is just one of the many stories. I was going to list a whole bunch of stories, but there's so many. Just Google mushroom trip Reddit. You'll find all sorts of stuff. So let's continue. Okay, this last slide, I just want to do a little Venn diagram of some of the quote-unquote good, quote-unquote bad, and things that can kind of go either way. So people say they have a very profound connection to nature and the people around them. Now, this includes their loved ones, friends, all sorts of different things. There are a lot of people, at least on Reddit, that talked about how they felt like nature was talking to them. Now, for the most part, this wasn't talking in words, but more of a non-verbal communication. They felt like everything was alive. The grass was alive. The wind was alive. They heard the sounds of nature, and the colors were far more profound than normal experience. So this provided a very deep, intimate connection with the world around them. And then there are people that said they experienced paranoia. Now, all of these experiences happen to people in various degrees and ways. Some people never have bad trips. Some people do. There are cases of people having psychotic breaks on mushrooms. It doesn't seem like a huge amount, but another risk when it comes to consuming these substances. There are a lot of people I mentioned before that have very meaningful changes in their life. I read a couple posts about people quitting drinking and drugs for good. They may have been full-blown alcoholics and drug addicts. Research does suggest that stronger, more profound experiences might have a stronger and longer lasting effect. This thing about changing drinking and drugs, this is definitely not everyone, but some people have found major life changes after their experiences. And then there's some people that are faced with this fear of dying. And at least in the moment, they feel like they might die, or they feel this profound fear. People also report negative thought loops. They might feel like they're stuck in their life situation. There are people who find a greater acceptance of death. And this is, at least from part one, an example of that research study that was done with terminal cancer patients. People also report colors being significantly different, as we've discussed before. These are just some of the many quote-unquote good and bad experiences. So let's talk about the things that could be either way. Open eye and closed eye visuals. These aren't always positive or happy. Again, it depends on the person and the situation. Sometimes people say not to look in a mirror. People report their faces being twisted and changed up. Some people embrace it. So on Reddit, some people are like, yeah, I love it. And then some people are like, I hated it. This can go either way. Emotion. Your emotions are very heightened when you're doing a mushroom trip. These can be positive or negative emotions. I put this in the middle because it kind of depends. This is again why it's important to understand the mindset that you have going into these experiences. Bodily sensations. Some people love them, some people don't like them. It depends on the person. And then faces. I think it's called pareidoia. Whatever the word is, people can see faces in certain things. This could be positive or negative, as I mentioned before. Depends on the person, their mindset, what's going on. So many things can affect a mushroom trip. It can go from quote-unquote good to quote-unquote bad very quickly. But what's nice is that there are techniques people know and people readily share online, places like Reddit, that can help you get out of your mind when you're going through a negative experience and help you kind of ground yourself if you feel like you're kind of losing the way and the experience isn't going the way you want it to go. So when you're having a bad trip, you're not just stuck. I saw people say, you got to remind yourself that it's not going to last forever and all sorts of different things. I might have mentioned this earlier, but there's a lot of research that says that bad trips can often lead to very positive results for a decent amount of people, but that's not everyone. So let's go through the summary and review what we learned. So we first talked about mushrooms in general, psilocybin, psilocin. We talked about the stigma and some of the research studies that were available in our part 1 recap. Then we kind of defined what a mushroom trip is. We talked about what it is and what it's not, trying to really figure out and get a clear delineation between what one could expect and what people kind of hear that's not necessarily true. And then we highlighted that these things are not for everyone. We kind of discussed some basics about subjectivity, about dosing, and then we talked about the prep work, set and setting, why those two things are very important when it comes to a mushroom trip. We spoke about what could be considered positives or negatives. Here, we really discussed how varied this stuff is and some of the work that you might have to do before you even get into this experience. We then talked about microdosing, how there are a lot of people who will microdose magic mushrooms. Maybe you don't want to have a full trip, but you want to get that benefit without being, in some ways, incapacitated. And people find a lot of use out of microdosing, enhanced mood, enhanced creativity. A real change on perspective allows you to kind of look at things differently. And it's not uncommon. People do microdosing for all sorts of different substances. Then we went a little deeper into subjective experience. Everyone's experience is very different. You're not going to have the same experiences. We talked about this guy, Michael Pollan, who wrote about his very interesting mushroom trip, seeing that futuristic city, being amazed by the colors, trying to come to terms with death, and this oneness he became with this musical instrument and this whole situation he was in. So we got to kind of see a pretty involved mushroom experience. Then I did a little Venn diagram talking about the good or the bad when it comes to what people experience, a connection to nature and people, maybe a negative thought loop, huge changes in life. We talked about the visuals, emotions, sensations, all sorts of different things. So that's all I got. I know it's been a while since part 1. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it really kind of helped you guys to understand how wide and varied these experiences are. If you've had these experiences, please comment in the comments. I want to kind of see what you guys have gone through, and I just find it interesting how different everyone's experience is and how it impacts people differently. So part 3, we're going to really just hit on a bunch of research and some other things. So thank you guys so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another video.